So this is the third of 3 videos on the early history of games and game sound. And this video is going to focus on how sound was actually generated in early games. So as you'll see here, this is a little outline of this video. There were 3 primary ways in which sound could be generated. The first of all was through various analog techniques. The second is through coding in the game, what we call programmable sound generators, that would go between the game's code actually through hardware in the arcade machine or the home console, translate that into music so through electrical impulses. And finally, the use of existing optical media, sort of bringing in tapes or laser discs or something like that, bring in other pieces of media and sort of have them in your game alongside the programmed sounds or in place of the programmed sounds. So this third option is generally an arcade-only option. One of the things that we see in the 1970s is that arcade machines start to be custom built, really custom designed to deliver the features that are necessary for that game. So we'll start to see arcade machines that actually have tape decks in them right along there to provide the music or the sound. So the simplest way that you might produce a little bit of a tone for your video game is what's called a piezo buzzer. So this image is from one of Karen Collins's articles on early game sound. This is sort of the top view on the right. It's a circular piezo element, and then like the side view on the left. And these are very, very thin. You can watch for another video where I'll actually demonstrate how a piezo buzzer works. But essentially, you pass a current through it, and depending on the strength of the current, that dictates how fast the piezo element will vibrate. So as you remember, faster vibration equals higher pitch, so you can sort of modulate the amount of electricity that you want to pass through this very simple element, and by that way you can control the pitch. You can have a sort of sustained buzzing, or you could use it to create little short beeps. So if you're designing something like Pong, for example, all you need is a couple of piezo buzzers that will go off at certain events, and this one's going to do that, or you pass it a different amount of current, it's going to make a different sound. Or you might double up the buzzer so that it ends up producing, twice the amount of noise. A step above that is a programmable sound generator. And so this becomes very significant, for the Atari, for the original Nintendo and the Famicom. We'll talk a lot in a couple of future lessons about the sound capabilities, the sound chips that were included in these early consoles. Usually they were limited to only a couple of different tracks, but this alone is much more flexible than having, a single buzzer that you're passing frequencies to and changing the music that way. You actually might be able to program, okay, this track gets the melody, this track gets the bass line, this track is going to produce some noise. So you see at the top of this diagram, the noise generator there. A lot of these chips would use a white noise generator that could just sort of generate psh, 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 white noise sounds, modulate them in certain ways, turn them on and off, and you can kind of imitate percussion sounds, or you could imitate explosions or something like that. Then below that, you've got a couple of tone generators. A lot of these would have 3 tracks, maybe, of actual musical sound that can be controlled. These are all sort of passed into a mixer. They're usually held on one chip. They're passed through and converted actually to sound signals. Those go through the speaker, either of the arcade game, or they go and get passed into the TV along with the game visual signals. So programmable sound generators enabled game designers to have composers write actual music for them, music with melodies and bass lines and recognizable musical elements, rather than really having to hand code every single sound. But they were still very limited, usually in terms of memory. You hear in the Beep documentary, you hear a lot about the aesthetics of looping music. Because memory was so limited, you weren't able to have very much music at all. Lots of early Nintendo games, you've got maybe 1 minute of music that sort of repeats itself infinitely. We'll see more about this later, but composers and game designers always had to make choices about how are we going to balance the needs of the music with multiple tracks versus the need to have multiple channels of sound effects. How are we going to either split that up or strategically turn the music off when we need to make a sound? So programmable sound generators are much more flexible than simply generating a buzzer tone or something like that, but they're still severely limited in the early days. We have a lot of first-hand accounts of what it was actually like to work under these conditions. A lot of composers had to work directly with code. If you look at the ROM files, the code files for early games like this, which I'll do in another video, a lot of times you see that the music is just code right alongside the rest of the game. So there's literally almost no difference between the code that runs the visuals or the gameplay. The code that runs the music is right in there alongside it. It's sort of one single file that runs the whole game. Unlike modern games where you'd have subroutines, you'd have sub-files, you'd have data files that are separate. Everything is kind of shoved into one, which meant that composers, either you had to write yourself or a company would provide a sort of interface by which to translate music into assembly language, or you had to actually write in assembly language, which is this very low-level form of coding that kind of works directly on memory and works directly on the electrical registers of the system to create the music. So we've got a lot of first-hand accounts of this. So Hip Tanaka, this well-known Nintendo composer, for example, says, quote, "Most music and sound in the arcade era was designed little by combining transistors, condensers, and resistance. Sometimes music and sound were even created directly into the CPU port by writing ones and zeros, outputting the wave that becomes sounds at the end. In the era when ROM capacities were only 1 kilobyte or 2 kilobyte, you had to create all the tools by yourself. The switches that manifest addresses and data were placed side by side, so you have to write something like 10001 literally by hand." So he's talking about this very low-level coding of music right alongside the coding of the game. Rob Hubbard, another composer, a composer who did a lot for the Commodore 64, says, quote, "The games that were programmed in like 1982, 1983, most of the music was done by the programmer. The programmer did everything in those days, and some of the music was just absolutely diabolical. I mean, it was embarrassing, you know. It was like a drunken monkey on the piano trying to play the Blue Danube or something. And I thought there has to be an opening for somebody who could at least get the notes right, or in the correct order, for God's sake." So the job of a game programmer, or sorry, the job of a game composer is actually sort of coming into existence in the early 80s as there's, increasing profit means increasing budgets and larger teams developing games. And so some composers like Hubbard saw their way into the industry. Hey, I actually understand music. I can do something a little bit better for your game than your programmers can. As we'll see in the readings by Will Gibbons later in this unit or the next unit, a lot of times games were created by small programming teams who incorporated existing classical music because it was music that they sort of knew by heart. You know, they knew famous pieces of classical music and they could just kind of code them in. And that's one of the reasons we get a lot of classical music in early games, is because programmers were doing all the work, as Hubbard says. So finally, the third type of sound that we see in these late 70s, early 80s games is actually optical media. And so optical media is a term for forms of storage media sort of through the 70s through the 90s that involved physically reading off of a disc. So for example, cassette tapes, 8-track tapes, CDs and DVDs are forms of optical media. They're actually read by a magnetic head or by a laser. And so 8 tracks are one form of optical media that was popular in the 1970s. This is the inside of an 8-track tape. As you can sort of see off to the left, there's a thick band of tape, and it's called 8-track tape because there were 8 specific tracks on there, although they were usually paired up. So in practice, you had 4 different stereo tracks. The tape would play all the way through the head, and as you can see in this picture of one of the Beatles' 8-track albums, the music would usually be split up into 4 different programs or 4 different tracks, and the tape would play all the way through for one track, and on the very left edge of the tape you'd have 4 or 5 songs. Then the second track of the tape, sort of in the middle, the tape would play through again, and you'd get the next 3 or 4 or 5 songs. Then program 3 you see here, you only have 2 songs because A Day in the Life is very long. That plays through, and then finally you've gotten to the other edge of the tape. It plays through the 4th time, and it plays the last 4 or 5 songs. So 8 tracks were a common form of optical media for music, and they actually were used sometimes in arcade games. So Triple Hunt from 1977, first year that the Atari VCS was out at home, they also were still experimenting with arcade games. So Triple Hunt is a sort of 3-in-1 game. You'll see there on the left side of the screen that there are, again, things to stick onto the screen to enhance the appearance of the game. Triple Hunt had this game Hit the Bear, as we see here. It also had Raccoon Hunt and Witch Hunt. Each of those are exactly as they sound. The game is configured so that you've got a gun positioned several feet away from the screen. Whichever game the arcade operator, the arcade or the pizza parlor or a bowling alley operator has loaded up, is the one that you play. And along with some simple programmable sound generator sounds, Triple Hunt came with an 8-track tape inside, and it would actually play appropriate sound effects. So you could get maybe wilderness noises, for Hit the Bear, or Witch Hunt, which has this sort of haunted mansion look with ghosts and witches, would have the sound of wind blowing through the trees and wolves howling in the distance to make it kind of creepy. So they were actually combining an 8-track tape that could record real sounds and have actual high fidelity. They were combining that with the very simple programmable sound generator that could only do beeps or sort of very simple programmed music. So this was an attempt to make a more realistic, more immersive experience. Another medium that ended up being used in video games was the Laserdisc. Laserdiscs came out in 1978. Which is also right around the time that VHS video cassettes would come out, and Betamax. Betamax completely fell by the wayside. Laserdisc mostly fell by the wayside. It was never nearly as popular as VHS was, but it was more popular in Japan, where about 10% of people had one. This is a picture of a Laserdisc. It's almost as big as an LP record, but it would go into a player, and you could actually play movies digitally. You could skip around tracks just like a DVD can. And so one of the most famous examples of a game that really had sound and visuals really ahead of its time is this game called Dragon's Lair. And Dragon's Lair, we'll watch a little clip of it, uses Laserdiscs to deliver animation and music and sound that are really on par with like a Saturday morning cartoon that you would have seen at the time. It's fully animated, has great sound quality because you could record much more on a Laserdisc than you could actually put in a computer chip or on a home console at the time. The drawback of this is that the gameplay is very limited. You sort of have this effect where in the early days of games, in the 80s and 90s, the higher the fidelity something is, the less flexible it is. So we'll see this effect over and over when we talk about soundtracks in the 90s. Once you got away from programmed soundtracks and you started to actually have an orchestra record your soundtrack, suddenly you can't change it as much. If you've had live musicians actually play it, it's a lot less flexible. So the gameplay of Dragon's Lair is basically reflex-based. As you'll see in this clip, you get little indications and you have to quickly move the stick, over to the left or over to the right or up to the top in order to avoid whatever hazard is popping up on the screen. And the gameplay is basically a reflex action, and when you get it right, it cues up the next segment, or if you get it wrong, it cues up your death, and you have to start over. So the game is put together in hundreds of very short segments that are kind of strung together.